Today our topic is soils and soil health, and it's being presented by Master Gardener Linda Goulden. And if you have questions, please put those in the chat box and we'll get to them at the end. Linda, are you all set?
I'm set. Good morning. Good morning. My name is Linda Goulden. I'm a Master Gardener volunteer here in Prince William County, and today we're talking about soil. Soil is much more than dirt. And maybe I can make the technology work. There we go. It's actually a really complex community. First, we're going to discuss what makes up soil. Then we're going to delve into how to determine what quality your soil is. And finally, we'll talk about things you can do to improve the soil where you are. So the first thing is, please note that we're not calling this dirt. Soil is a layered structure. Here's a definition from the Soil Science Society of America. Soil, they say, is the unconsolidated mineral or organic material on the immediate surface of the earth that serves as a natural medium for the growth of land plants. This unconsolidated material has been subjected to and shows the effects of genetic and environmental factors, including climate, water, and temperature effects, macro and microorganisms. It's conditioned by relief acting on parent material over a period of time. Well, that's sure a mouthful. Soil is layered. In soil science, we call those layers horizons. The horizons, if you can see my cursor here, the first is going to be the humus layer, which is the organic material on the top. Just below that organic layer is the topsoil layer. This is called, the humus layer is called the O horizon, while the topsoil is the A horizon. Just below the topsoil, there's a mixed layer called the alluviated horizon, which is a mixture of subsoil and topsoil. It gets mixed in by some of the creatures that we're going to talk about just a little later on. Below that subsoil is actually the parent material. That parent material is something that we can't change. That's what comes with our location and geology. So soil is not just a place to plant. It's not just dirt. It actually is a really complex community. Increasing the organic material in your soil is an essential part of gardening. A healthy soil has lots of biological life, and these organisms need organic matter to survive and to thrive. Organic matter increases fertility by feeding all of the biological life, and that in turn helps with the decomposition of organic matter, replenishment of soil nutrients, humus formation, promotion of root growth, and nutrient uptake. Humus is an important byproduct of organic material. It improves soil fertility and plant growth and is a result of the decomposition of organic matter. It provides the glue that holds soil particles together and helps to prevent erosion and increases a soil's moisture holding ability. In addition to all of this organic material, it gets broken down into very important macronutrients. Those macronutrients are the things you see on the label when you buy fertilizer, the NPK number. N stands for nitrogen, which is important for vigorous vegetative growth and a plant's dark green color. Unless it's the plant's natural color, when plants become pale or yellowish, that could be a sign of a nitrogen deficiency. Phosphorus, which is also a byproduct of the breakdown of organic material, affects overall plant quality, stem strength, root growth, and normal plant maturity. Potassium is not a component of any part of the plant compounds, but it plays an important role in lots of plant life. Potassium is needed to sustain growth and reproduction. It also helps with root growth and helps increase drought tolerance. So soil is this very complex community of both living and non-living things. We're going to talk about the inorganic makeup, the microorganism makeup, the macroorganism makeup, plant roots, and other soil organic matter. Let's look at the inorganic components first. Soils are described as loamic, sandy, or clayic in nature, and this graph shows you how those components interact. The amount of clay in the soil is represented on the left side of the pictorial there, with 0% being in the bottom corner up to 100% in the apex. Silt is shown on the right side of that triangle, starting at the apex of the triangle down to 0 at the, down to 100% at the bottom corner. And sand is the other inorganic component shown across the bottom of this pictorial, starting with no sand over here, all the way to 100% sand. Good soil, or soil that we would consider growing things in, would typically be in this lower corner in the loam and silt loam area of the graph. So what does this mean for us? Clay soils have a structure if they're not compressed and can hold water. Sandy soils are not able to have much structure and don't hold water well. They don't have any organic material, so they support fewer microbes and fewer of the macro herd, including earthworms, insects, and roots. In general, they have a really poor structure. So you can see this particular jar is representing a soil that has little clay and silt with lots of sand. The water can drain right through it. Loam soil is actually up to about 30% clay, with silt and sand representing the remaining. And finally, there's clay soil on the right that contains more than 50% clay. That kind of soil is probably closer to what we have in Virginia. We tend to get more clay. So our soils are prone to compaction and a lot of water retention. Now, in addition to the actual physical makeup of the soil, we need to look at some of the chemical properties, and pH is probably one of the most important. pH, a brief review for those of you who don't remember from high school chemistry, it's a measure of the acidity or alkalinity of the soil. The scale for measuring pH goes from 1 to 14, with 1 being very acidic and 14 being very basic. Now, this scale is not linear, and what that means is that a pH of 2 is not 2 times different than a pH of 4, but actually 100 times different. So small changes in pH mean big differences in the amount of acid that's in a soil. Most plants grow best in a neutral soil. Neutral soil means that the amount of acid and base are roughly equivalent. You can adjust the pH of your soil within a very narrow range by the addition of lime, which will raise the pH, or aluminum sulfate, which will lower the pH, but you can't change the parent material. So pH changes are small in nature, but sometimes very necessary, because for plant growth, we want to have the pH somewhere in this neutral range so that plants are able to take in the nutrients that they need.
Linda?
Yes.
My apologies, I joined late. Did you establish a rule about questions?
Yes. Could you please put your questions in the chat box?
Oh, certainly. Thank you.
Okay, let's talk about the microbes first. Now that we've talked about the physical and chemical makeup of the soil. We're going to talk about microorganisms, macroorganisms, plant material, and organic material. So here's a graphic that shows you roughly the population in 1 gram of soil. Now, I want to just remind you, 1 gram is a very small amount of soil. It's the approximate mass of a standard paper clip. So we've got up to 500 million bacteria in that very small amount of soil. This doesn't count the big guys, the earthworms and the other, even the mammals that live in the soil. But this is what's living in just 1 gram of soil. Tremendous amount of life. The soil microorganisms aren't distributed throughout the soil in an even fashion. They live in small communities on microaggregates of soil particles. Remember that food web that you studied in high school biology? Microcommunities in soil are primarily decomposers, and they make organic material into its components, which can then be used by plants. Microorganisms change the plant and animal detritus from higher trophic levels into the actual chemical components that will be accessible to plants to uptake in via their roots. In general, turfgrass plants, vegetables, and non-native ornamentals prefer a higher population of bacteria. Those bacteria are able to mineralize nutrients. They provide bacterial slime, which creates better soil structure and more alkalinity in the soil. They produce food for other microbes. There are actually specialized bacteria which are responsible for taking nitrogen from the atmosphere and changing it from nitrogen gas into a form called nitrates, which are then soluble in water so that plants can uptake those. Preferred by hardwood trees, fungi and produce a more acid soil. They're powerhouse soil builders with their mycorrhizae that burrow through the soil. They are also decomposers. They are really good and very prevalent in areas that are dominated by hardwood trees and forests in general. After the micro herd, we talk about the macro animals. The macro herd includes all insects, arthropods, worms, all the stages of insects, larval through adult, and small mammals. They're responsible for mixing and aerating the soil. They're extremely sensitive to pesticides and also any change in the chemical composition. If you add fertilizer, you're going to impact all of the organisms that live in the soil, but the macro herd are especially sensitive. Essentially, if you change the chemistry of the soil, the balance of power shifts. And then we have the plants. Plants can add structure to the soil with their rootlets holding the soil in place. They can break down microstructures in soil. They can add organic material. They can even remove toxins like metals from the soil. I told you that soil is a living community and that community requires the right balance of inorganic components, that would be the sand, silt, loam, and pH, to form microaggregates. Those are small particles where the microbes and macrobes and plants set up housekeeping. Plants have an incredibly important role in the type of soil and the quality of soil, and it starts at the very tip of the roots in the region called the rhizosphere. The rhizosphere is the region of soil nearest the plant where the chemistry and the microbiology is most influenced by the plant. The plant is able to make sugars and complex compounds that the microbes require. Those microbes in turn create they break down the inorganic material which the plants can't use into materials that the plants are able to uptake. Plants and microbes meet in that rhizosphere, and that's where the exchange of materials occurs. Plants actively manage this rhizosphere region. They can devote up to 30% of their energy to producing the microbial colonies, and in turn, those colonies protect the plant roots from other microbes which could be harmful. So this is a real beneficial relationship. You will find that folks who use organic fertilizers and add organic material, they're actually encouraging those plant microbe relationships. If you don't use organic material and tend to use more chemical fertilizers, you're directly feeding the plant, but you're not feeding the microbes. Hence, the microbes will die off. So if you are going to use conventional fertilizers, it's recommended that you always use slow release so that you don't impact the microorganisms severely, and you're still giving the plant the boost that you want it to have. Okay, so what makes good soil? You have to have high organic matter content, good structure. You have to be able to have water infiltrate and drain through the soil. There has to be water available for plants. You must be providing a good habitat for soil organisms with the appropriate pH, low salt levels, low toxicity, and balanced fertilizer. In a good soil, the microbes are actually the source of fertility, not fertilizers. The common thread here is that all of these are made possible in a biologically active soil. So let's talk about how to evaluate your soil, how to tell if you have good fertile soil, and one of the best ways is to look at what's growing there. If you're concerned about soil and you actually want to have some numbers on how good your soil is or what needs to be done with it, the first thing we would recommend would be a soil test by the Virginia Tech Soil Lab. This is especially useful if you're dealing with turf grass or you're deciding to put in new planting beds. Now, you'll see there's an email at the bottom of the page. You're going to see that email over and over again because that's where you can get information and a soil test kit. So you might want to note that email. That's your source of information. So the first thing to evaluate your soil would be a chemical test done by the Virginia Tech Soil Lab. We provide, the Master Gardeners, the Virginia Extension Service provides soil test kits for free. There is a charge for the soil analysis. I believe it's $10. The second thing you can do, and we're going to go through that in great and gory detail in just a second, is a soil assessment. And we can provide you with a copy of the soil assessment. Again, just send us an email at the help desk and we'll be happy to provide that. This two-pronged approach, looking at both the chemical and the physical condition of your soil, looks at both biological and chemical conditions to allow you to assess completely what your soil may need. So this is the self-check for your soil. This is the second part of that test. Again, the first part is sending a soil sample to Virginia Tech. let's quickly go over the things that you would be looking for in this soil assessment. The first thing is, what plants are growing in the area that you're talking about? What is the ground cover? So you're asked to look at, is it less than 50% plant cover? Is it between 50 and 75? And you rate it down here based on how much coverage is on the soil. So this is essentially, do you have bare soil, or are there plants and mulch covering your soil? The second test that you're going to do is called compaction. You want to look at how dense or how compacted your soil particles are. Probably the best thing to use for this is a wire. Wire from a coat hanger would work really well. You want to insert a 1/8 inch diameter wire into the ground to see how easily it goes in and how deeply it goes in. So compaction, again, you can rate it whether or not it penetrates, how if it goes to at least 8 inches or if it penetrates easily. The second or the third thing that you're going to look at in the soil evaluation is, what's the diversity of life on the surface of the soil. Now, this isn't digging in the soil. All of the tests on this part of the evaluation don't require you to disturb the soil. So you're just going to get down close to the ground and look for animals on the ground. Any kind of insect or invertebrate, you just want to count the number of different species. And the final assessment in this part of the test is, what's the leaf color? Whatever you're growing, is it grass or a vegetable crop? Are the leaf colors normal? Any kind of abnormal color is going to indicate some kind of nutritional or other problem. You want to look for, are the leaves fully formed? Is there good growth at the tip of the plant? So these are the first things that you're going to evaluate. The second part of the evaluation requires you to disturb the soil. You're asked to dig up an 8 by 8 block of soil and look at it closely. The first thing that you want to evaluate is, what do the roots in that soil block look like? Are they normal? Are they fully developed? Are they present throughout the entire root zone? Second part requires you to pull your chunk of earth apart and look for earthworms. Count the number of earthworms. Earthworms are a really good indication of the health of your soil. They're shredders. They take organic material and they distribute it throughout the soil. Then you're going to check the soil structure. If you recall those jars of soil and water that I showed in a much earlier slide, that's exactly the sort of thing you're going to do. You're going to break a handful of soil. The first thing you're going to do is break a handful of soil and see if it breaks up into small clods, or if it doesn't easily break up, or if it becomes total dust. That kind of soil is going to have a hard time allowing air and water to pass through. So we're going to check the soil structure and then move on to how well that soil is able to form those small particles, those aggregates that are the home for all of our life in the soil. So the directions are there for how to select a couple of small pieces of soil and drop them into water. You're going to take a look at how long it takes those small particles to break up. And the directions are very clear. If you have fairly unimproved soil, you're typically going to see a mix of grass and weeds. Your soil will probably be heavily compacted. The minerals may not be available because the pH of the soil is not in a range that allows them to be soluble. The soil organic material will be very low, and you won't see much sign of earthworms. This kind of soil is going to favor anaerobic conditions, which are not good for plants. The water is going to run off of this soil rather than soaking in. If you have good garden soil, you're going to see a lot of earthworms. You'll see good plant cover. It will actually be sort of almost fluffy with 20 to 30% of air and water in the soil. So good soil is going to support a diversity of life. Plants need 16 elements for normal growth. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen come from the air and the water. Those three plus nitrogen make up about 95% of plant solids. Nitrogen in general, although it makes up 78% of the atmosphere, is not available to plants. It requires those nitrogen fixing bacteria to change it into nitrates, which are then available to the plants to uptake. There are 12 other elements that are essential for plant growth, and I'm not going to list those all for you, but those elements are coming from the soil, from the parent material. And there's usually enough of those available in the soil if it's at the right pH for the plants to be able to access it. So good soil is living, biologically active soil. And how do we get there? Well, in general, work with nature. We're going to build and protect our soil. Check the soil regularly. We recommend for turf that you have your soil tested every 3 years to make sure that the soil is at the right pH and has the right level of nutrients to support the plants you want to grow. We want to nurture that soil ecosystem, those macro and micro invertebrates. And if we have areas that are bare soil, we can use cover crops to invigorate the soil for year round. So some key things to improve the soil, of course, after you've tested it and you know exactly what you're working with. You want to add organic material. Organic material in the form of compost is the best. If the soil test results indicate that the pH is not in the ideal range, you want to adjust that. Typically, it's by adding lime. If you have bare soil, grow cover crops or green manures. Add nutrients as needed. If you have your soil tested by Virginia Tech, it's very specific on what nutrients your soil might need. For example, if it's low in nitrogen or low in phosphorus. We also want to urge that there's minimal digging or mechanical manipulation. That kind of tilling will break up the microaggregates in soil that has a high clay component, can cause compaction. If you are interested, send us an email requesting Building Healthy Soil, the Soil Health Self-Check handout, that's the one that I went through with you, or a soil test kit. Again, the kit is free and the analysis costs $10. We also have a great program for turf called Best Lawns. If you'd like a Best Lawns consult, again, email us at Master Gardeners and we'll be happy to send you the information on that. I'm sure there are questions. So does somebody want to read the questions from the chat box?
Will Virginia Tech test soil out of state? They might be moving to Maryland for the summer.
That one I don't know. I would assume.
I know the answer to that.
Okay.
So Maryland closed their soils lab. Well, it's been over 10 years since they closed their lab. People in Maryland usually send their soil samples either to Tech, the University of Delaware, or Penn State. So the short answer is yes. We get samples from Maryland all the time.
Okay, thank you. I can pull up the chat box as well. I'm sorry.
Before you move on, I live in New Jersey. Is there a different?
New Jersey, you'd like to go to Rutgers.
Okay, so the contact info you've given us doesn't really apply for me.
I can
I'll reach out to Rutgers. Thank
I'll
you.
look it up, Susan, for you.
Oh, thank you.
Put it in the.
Great.
Let's see. If I'm going to garden in a raised bed, do I still need to test my garden soil? Because essentially I'm going to build new soil to the garden anyway.
Well, you're going to want to test the soil that you're planting in. So if you're going to put new soil in, put the soil in and send the test off of the soil that you're planting in.
Let's see. What's the best way to break down clay soil if you don't till it?
Add organic material on the top and aerate. Is this, it kind of depends on, is this a garden or is it turf? If it's turf, adding compost, a layer of compost, and then aerating is one way to improve the structure of the soil.
And if it's a garden, it would be adding compost and using cover crops.
Right. Green manure might be a possibility for a garden plot. Thank you.
What do you recommend in the curb areas between the road and the sidewalk?
Prayers. That area, it depends on, a lot of homeowners associations don't let you put anything but turf there. So you would treat it just as you would your lawn. It probably needs a lot of TLC from the standpoint, that's going to be pretty poor soil to start with. So go heavy on adding organics to it, lots of compost. If you can aerate it, that's kind of hard because I know those are narrow and it's hard to get the machine in there to do aeration. But lots of TLC, and that's one where you want to make sure that you're giving it adequate water. Those areas typically have really bad drainage, and so water is a problem with them.
So to add to that, this is an area where you do want to till. In an ideal situation, put down a tarp, take up 4 or 5 inches of soil from that area, put compost in, mix it up, and then put it back in that area. Aside from being very narrow and it's very compacted, and every year you're going to get compacted. It's going to get compacted with snow probably. Those are, as Linda said, prayer is your best answer for those areas.
Sorry, we can't really help a lot there.
Is there a benefit to adding gypsum to clay soil?
I don't know the research on that one. Thomas, can you address it? I mean,
Yes.
Anecdotally, yes, there is, but I'll let you take that one.
So the benefits of gypsum, there are some agricultural situations where it's a benefit. From a homeowner standpoint, it's not beneficial at all. It's not really going to do what you want it to do, to break up clay. Organic matter is a much better option. How do we choose an appropriate cover crop to rotate in our garden spaces?
I'm glad you asked that because we have a wonderful YouTube video on our YouTube channel about cover crops that could help you select the best crop for the purpose.
And keep in mind that in a garden situation, pretty much anything's a cover crop if you make it one. So you've got a lot more flexibility than the traditional ag cover crops. But if you need more help on something specific to your situation, just email the Master Gardener Help Desk and we'll see what we can do to get you straightened out.
Okay.
What's the difference between tilling and aerating?
Tilling disturbs the entire bed of the soil and uses blades to mix it together. Aerating is just punching holes in it or pulling out plugs so that you can get better surface contact between the air and the soil. You're not actually disturbing the entire structure of the soil.
The other issue is that, if you till your lawn, you're going to destroy it. If you aerate your lawn, you're going to help it. Just make sure that you're not aerating when the ground is too wet. Next question, should cover crops be added to lawns? Lots of compaction and bare soil in the lawn.
That's a really good question. A lot of folks use, it isn't really a cover crop, but it's planting clover in the lawn to increase the organic material, to increase the nitrogen fixation that occurs in the soil. That's usually a good idea if you can tolerate the white clover flowers, and it wouldn't be recommended if you were trying an area that's used as a play area, because you're going to have an increase in the number of bees. But clover is always a good thing to add to your turf for the increased nutrients and the nitrogen fixing bacteria.
I will say also that if it's in the backyard where the HOA can't get after you, daikon radishes over the winter sometimes can help.
Yeah, you don't harvest those daikon radishes. You plant them and you let them decompose in the soil.
My lack of knowledge, we use Roundup to get rid of an invasive ground cover. How long should we wait in order to grow a veggie garden in that area?
First off, you're going to have to read the label directions on the Roundup. I'm not sure what they recommend. Roundup actually has a very short half-life, meaning that it doesn't persist in the soil. So I wouldn't think a long time. But again, the label should have that information on it.
Yeah, generally depending on what specific Roundup product you use, it's going to vary anywhere from a couple weeks to you use the wrong Roundup problem, 6 months. Let's see. I heard adding sand to clay soil becomes a brick. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Why not aerate with a fork?
With a fork, a digging fork?
I'm assuming a garden fork, yeah.
Yeah, okay. You could. There's it depends. If you're doing a garden, that's probably not a bad plan. The thing is, you don't want to disturb all of the soil. You just want to make spaces where the air can contact the soil. And the idea of aerating is not to disturb the entire surface, but just provide holes where the air can get in. So a garden fork would potentially work. The thing is, if you're covering a large area, it's going to take a long time.
Chris said that they read that native plants should be in unimproved soil, but theirs is very sandy. Should they add compost?
That's never a bad thing. The other thing is to look for some native plants that typically grow in sandier soils.
This person has an area along their creek that's heavily compacted. What can they do to help native plants, give them a chance against the invasives that are flooded in, the invasive seeds that are flooded in?
That's a tough one.
Yeah, that is. I can't.
I mean, essentially what you would have to do was keep control of the invasives as much as possible. You know, keep pulling back any of the invasives that come in, and that's about the only thing you can do to provide an environment where the natives can flourish, is just keep pulling back those invasives.
Okay, we have a question about, for a homeowner, do you recommend the investment $100 into a pH meter?
No. The pH of the soil does not change drastically with anything that you do. pH is a really tough one to move. What we would recommend is have the soil tested by a reputable lab like Virginia Tech, get their recommendation on what to do to adjust the pH, and then apply that and wait 3 years until you check it again, because it's not something that's easily changed.
The other thing I would add to that is, you know, if you're going to spend $100 on soil testing, that's about 30 years worth of soil tests if you go through a lab like Tech. And keep in mind that your pH meter is going to tell you the pH. It's not going to tell you how much lime you need to add to fix that pH, whereas a lab will.
The other thing is most of the pH meters that you purchase are ion-specific electrodes and really need to be calibrated. So, you know, unless you're talking lab grade equipment, you're really much better off spending $10 and sending a soil sample to Tech.
Is compost tea worth the effort?
I haven't seen the research on it. Lots of folks swear by it for vegetable gardens. Why not? I would prefer to just use the compost because that's adding organic material to the soil. Just my 2 cents.
So the real thing with compost tea is it depends on the quality. And quite honestly, for the average homeowner, figuring out what quality compost tea you're making is really difficult. So I would agree with Linda that I would add the organic matter, but compost tea certainly isn't going to hurt. It's just a matter of how much effort you want to put into it. That looks like our last question, unless anybody else has questions.
I'd like to remind folks we do have some classes coming up, and you can find the links to register for Garden Principles, Winter Sowing, or Insects and Critters at the VCE horticultural page, and it's listed there. We'd love to see you at some of our upcoming classes. Thank you.
We've got one last question about, do you add compost to the top or dig it in?
Top dressing is fine.
So
Again, you don't want to disturb the soil all that much. If you have a good population of the macroinvertebrates like the earthworms and the moles and the voles and all those little critters, they will dig it in for you.
Yeah, leaf
yeah,
compost.
so if you're starting from zero, and you're going to till anyway, that's a good time to add lots and lots of compost, but otherwise top dressing is fine. We have a question, when's the best time of year to add compost?
Anytime.
Yeah.
Whoops, we've got a bunch of questions that just zipped by me.
The earthworms question, Thomas.
Which one was that?
Is there a difference between the beneficial effect of native versus non-native earthworms?
And also, is it worthwhile to buy earthworms to add?
We're always going to tell you to buy native if possible. There actually are some invasive earthworms that are, well, actually, earthworms are not native. I don't think, we don't have any native earthworms, do we?
No, but they've been naturalized.
Right. Okay.
So the whole argument with earthworms is, you know, there are some invasive worms, but generally speaking, in a garden situation, in most cases, adding worms isn't a big deal as long as they have enough food, which means you have to have a lot of organic matter, because otherwise you're adding worms to starve.
And if you
Also-
add leaf compost on
I'm
top,
sorry?
adding leaf compost on top brings lots of worms in.
That's true as well. And if you are vermiculturing and you're vermicomposting and you've got those red wigglers, you put them in the garden, they will freeze to death over the winter. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Let's see. For a raised bed, do I remove the grass?
Yes.
So with raised beds, one of the things you have to think about is if you've got really dense soil underneath, you want to break that soil up and add some compost, then add your new soil on, because you don't want to create an impermeable layer that's going to pond the water in the root zone. Then you'll have all sorts of root rots. If your raised bed is not raised very high, the grass will grow right through that. So, if you're looking at like maybe a 4-inch raised bed, grass is going to grow through that. So ideally you do want to kill that, but you also want to break up that ground as well. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say there's a new question about, is one soil test sample enough for a 1/4 acre?
Okay, so soil testing, the way that we do it for labs is generally you take a bunch of subsamples around the area that you're sampling. So if you've got a 1/4 acre, you take a bunch of random subsamples, pull out the grass, pull out any rocks, and then mix all that soil together, and from that you draw your sample. So the short answer is yes, but you just don't want to go and pick one spot in the yard and use that as your sample. You want to have it representative of the whole area.
Where can I get the soil health check handout?
I put the email in the chat box.
Okay.
So just send us an email at mastergardener@pwcgov.org.
Okay.
Is black cow the same as organic compost?
I'm sorry, black what?
Black cow. Black cow is composted manure.
Oh,
I'm not sure it qualifies as organic because you don't always know what the cows have eaten. It's compost, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it's quote organic, but it does add organic matter. Well, let me back up. It's not organic in terms of organic certified, like you would go and buy organic grapes. It is organic in the sense that it has a lot of organic matter in it.
Thomas, what is the name of the stuff that comes from the Baltimore waste treatment? That's not organic either.
Honestly, I don't remember.
Inorganic? Yes.
No, Milorganite comes from Milwaukee. There's a locally grown, or
oh,
there's a local one from Baltimore.
okay,
I don't
sorry.
remember what it's called.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of it, but it's sold at the garden centers.
Leaf grow.
Leaf grow.
No, the product I'm thinking about is actually a sludge like Milorganite, but leaf grow does come from Baltimore. That's true. I forgot about that.
And it's not organic necessarily.
Not necessarily, no, but leaf grow is a high quality compost.
I have a question, but I can't seem to send it on the chat. May I
Okay.
ask it? Can I go
Sure,
ahead?
go ahead.
Okay. When I clean my fish pond, I put the fish pond water on my garden. Is that okay? I don't seem to have any problems with it, but I'm just wondering if that's the fertilizer I guess I'm using.
No, that shouldn't be a problem. Any excess nitrogen that's in the water is going to act as fertilizer.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Let's see. For the first phase on the discussion form, on the soil card, when you're observing animal life in your soil, the square foot area, basically you're talking about if I'm remembering right, it's an 8x8
Yes.
area.
Yes.
It's a really small area that you're taking a representative sample of with the soil health card. Next question, do I need to lay cardboard? Which I guess depends on the situation. If you're trying to kill grass, cardboard is helpful, but I'm not exactly sure Jennifer, what you're asking there. Next question is, how good is compost made from leaves collected in the fall?
It's excellent. That's really good compost. We call that gardener's gold.
Yeah, you just have to make sure you add enough green material to help it break down. Is it okay to add compost that hasn't completely broken down where you can still see bits of eggshell?
That's probably fine, yes.
Yeah, the big thing you want to worry about is if the compost hasn't gotten up to the right heat, you may have weed seeds there. But generally, if you just have bits of eggshell, it's going to be okay. Eggshell takes a lot longer to break down than some of the other things that you have in there.
There's a question in the chat box about what's the maximum space you should consider for one soil test. Really, you need to look at how much difference there is across whatever area you're measuring. If you have vastly different, like a slope and then a valley, they're going to be very different soils. So you might want to consider 2 soil tests. It really depends on how different the terrain is, because you can have a number of really different soils in a fairly small area if the topology is real varied.
And you should do it for different plant types. So, if you want to do a soil test for your yard, you want to do a sample for the turf separately from your ornamentals because their pH and nutrient requirements are different. Can we add compost to a vegetable garden? Oh, if we add compost to a vegetable garden, can we just add, say, 2 to 3 inches of compost on top?
You can. It's probably more advantageous to add a smaller amount, like under an inch. Although if you're using it as a mulch to keep weeds down, 2 or 3 inches would be fine.
Yeah, as long as you're not covering seedlings, should be good.
We have a question in the chat box. Is there a way to see this program again? Yeah, it'll be on our YouTube page.
I posted it. I'll post it again.
Okay, thank you. And the question about the 20-inch raised bed, I can't imagine grass coming up through 20 inches of dirt, but, stranger things have happened.
Yeah, that probably should be enough, unless it's Bermuda grass. Then all bets are off.
There's a question about manure. Do you see that, Thomas?
I'm scrolling down.
The order preference for use.
Oh, order preference in manure. So manure should be composted. Horse manure, I would say I would avoid. And the reason for that is that there are some pesticides used on pastures for horse hay that have residual effects that will survive passing through the horse. And we have had instances of people putting horse manure on their gardens and it killing their gardens. And the reason is it had some of that pesticide residue. If you can get it, alpaca, because alpaca doesn't burn as easily as the others, so it doesn't have to be quite as composted. But I would say as long as it's composted really well, then it should be fine. As to how old it should be, it depends on how quickly it's composted, which has to do with the ratio of nitrogen and carbon in the manure in the composting pile. Generally, I'd say at least a year old, just to be safe. Let's see. Can you grind up an eggshell in a blender with coffee grounds? Oh, yes, you can use coffee ground and eggshells together. They work fine. Is vermiculture better or the same as regular compost?
I don't have any input on that one. It's all organic material, so I'm sure that whatever you add that's organic material is going to be fine.
So Vermicom Compost actually, they're both going to do the same thing. Vermicom Compost is going to act a little bit faster, so you want to be careful how much vermicompost you put down. And the reason I say that is if you go back to that whole soil food web, one of the first people that are going to go up and get the organic matter that you top dress with are going to be worms. They're going to come up and start eating stuff. Their poop is going to be acted on by other microbes, and that's how those nutrients get cycled. So vermicompost is just basically worm poop. So you're skipping a step, as it were, in the garden outside. So either way, you're going to do the same thing. Just be careful about how much vermicompost you add at one time.
There's a question about weed cloth when you're putting a raised bed down. Should you put weed cloth and then place the bed on top of it?
You can. The only, again, it depends on the depth of your raised bed, because you don't want that weed cloth to restrict the roots from the plants that you're growing. You might be better off with putting down cardboard,
And
because eventually that cardboard will decay.
And Thomas, you have a lasagna gardening video on our YouTube?
Yes.
Yes, and that's a good thing to watch. And then there's a good question about fresh wood chips. How long should one wait before adding it to the garden?
So with wood chips, the problem with adding fresh wood chips is that the microbes that start breaking them down have a specific nitrogen to carbon ratio in their bodies, and that's what they're trying to eat. And so when you add fresh wood chips that are heavily carbon, they're going to suck nitrogen out of the soil temporarily. Generally speaking, I would wait at least a couple months before you put them in the garden.
But they're great also if you have them to use them underneath your shrubs and trees.
They do make good mulch.
They make good mulch, and they're good for weed control. All right.
We have a large exposed tree roots in an area with steep erosion. Can I put down compost in a cover crop with wood chips rather than soil to allow the roots to breathe? Will this deter erosion? If you can get the cover crops to take root, yes. And in that case, ideally, I would go with a more perennial cover crop, something like alfalfa or red clover, because those will usually, they're about 5-6 years is their lifespan, and that will give time for the soil to build up rather than having to put down cover crops every season.
Someone asked, I would like to create a native plant and food garden in my yard, but the previous owners put Bermuda grass in the front yard. I was going to keep the path Bermuda grass, but your comment about it spreading 1 minute makes, I keep losing that.
Yeah, I don't know where you are, but in most, well, I take that back. If you live, say, Richmond or lower in the south, Bermuda grass is actually a usable turf. If you are above Richmond, basically it's considered a weed. The big problem with Bermuda grass is it is really, really aggressive, especially in warm weather. If you are going to keep Bermuda grass, you're going to have to keep, trim it and make sure that it stays where it's supposed to stay. And don't fertilize it, because if you fertilize it, it's just going to go crazy.
You've already answered the question about mulching with wood chips, correct?
Yes.
I think that's it. Ditto for Zoysia, yes, right?
Zoysia is not as aggressive. Zoysia is actually a really good low maintenance turf.
Mhm.
Zoysia doesn't take much fertilizer. Actually, too much fertilizer will kill it. So Zoysia is a good low maintenance. The big problem with Zoysia, again, depending on where you are, north to south, is that the farther north you are, the less time of the year that Zoysia is green. And so you can either put up with having a tan lawn for a great deal of the year, say here in Northern Virginia, or you can do what they're doing in some parts of Virginia where they're actually dyeing it with like football field dye to keep it green, and it will stay green. And then once it starts growing, you mow that dyed area off with your first mowing. But that to me sounds like a lot more work than
And we
what
have,
I'm gonna do.
and we also have a great Dr. Goatley turf seminar. And that date is in March, is it? I'll check.
Yes, I don't remember the date, but yes, Dr. Goatley, who is the Extension Turf Specialist, will be doing an evening webinar sometime in March, and we'll be having those dates up on our social media here shortly if they're not
Yes.
already.
It's actually on our horticulture classes page now.
Oh, okay, I didn't realize it was up.
It is on, sorry, his spring tour, I just found, it's on our Facebook pages too. Great. I think that's it. And welcome everybody from out of Virginia. We're glad to have you join our classes.